Hello, Naidoo. Thank you for joining us for the Share Africa interviews. You are an activist, was a former minister in your native country, South Africa, and now member of the board of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Could you please introduce yourself to our public? Where were you born? When? Tell us a little about your story.
I was born in Durban. It's a city in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. My great-grandmother came from the south of India to work on the sugar farms of Natal. It was a time in 1864 when in fact slavery had been abolished, but they were practically slaves who came to work on those farms. And so I am the fourth generation descendant from her. And so I grew up in South Africa, born in 1954, at a time when apartheid was tightening its shackles around the population that was not white and increasing its oppression and repression of people in order that they serve the interest of a white minority. So that's the context in which I grew up. At the age of 4 years old, we were evicted from our home because we were the wrong color on the wrong side of the street. And that, in a sense, really made me really angry. And I grew up with a lot of anger, like with millions of other Black South Africans, so South Africans who were white. And I felt angry about myself. I was angry with my parents. I was angry with the fact that whenever I turned, the doors were closed on me. And so it was in my teenage years, as a 15-year-old, that I met an extraordinary charismatic student leader called Steve Biko. And this was in the late 60s, when in fact in France, students were rising up against the status quo. Across much of the world, there was young people were saying, challenging the status quo against the Vietnam War in the United States, the rise of Black consciousness and Black power, the fact that racism was being challenged in a very real way, whether that was through the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, or whether it was the Black Panther movement led by Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis. And in Africa, we are seeing the rise of the anti-colonial liberation movements. And so we were inspired by all of that. And so I remember being in a crowded church hall in my teens, listening to Steve Biko. And the thing that he said then is something that remains very much in my head today, as if it happened yesterday. Said, you have nothing to lose but your chains, because the mind of the oppressed is the main weapon in the hands of the oppressor. And that inspired me. It took my anger and it channeled it into a political cause. And that political cause changed my trajectory of life. And so I became an anti-apartheid activist, still in school. I went into university, and that's where I was inspired to become part of the organization that Steve Biko had set up. And then in 1976, millions of us stood up, ostensibly to protest against the imposition of Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, in our school curriculum. But in reality, it was a rejection of the status quo. We were angry, and that 1976 rebellion was the crossroads that South Africa faced. And so we challenged the system, and we were smashed. And when we asked ourselves what went wrong, we realized that we had left behind our parents, we had left behind the peasants, we had left behind the workers. And so many hundreds of us left university at that time to go back and organize. And that's what we did. We went back and we organized people in the factories, in the shops, in the mines, in the villages, in the townships, in the universities. And we built up this mass struggle that challenged apartheid. And that's how I became the leader of the trade union movement. Because in the late 70s, it was still illegal for African workers to join trade unions, but we fought for recognition. And I became the general secretary, the founding general secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which became a huge organization and really the backbone of our liberation struggle. And when Mandela was released, in our conversations with him, he insisted that I join the parliament with other trade union leaders, and that's what I did. And I became the Minister for Reconstruction and Development in his cabinet, and then later the Minister of Communications. And cut a long story short, that's how my life unfolded. I became involved in a global campaign to end malnutrition, affecting 2 billion people in the world, and then came back to the understanding and the reality that changing a system is not rocket science. Fighting for democracy, fighting for social justice, fighting for human rights. We are today at a new crossroads, but a crossroads not just for one country, the crossroads for ourselves as a humanity. On one hand, we have a pathway that would lead to increased destruction of our environment, our natural environment. We are in the midst of an ecological emergency. The COVID-19 pandemic is going to become an epidemic with many more pathogens and viruses released because of what we're doing to Mother Earth in cutting down our forests, in polluting and poisoning our soil, in pumping plastics into the oceans that kill life in the oceans. And so, in a sense, we're going to enter a period of great uncertainty unless we change. And this is what faces us today. You, the generation of young people, have the opportunity to change that trajectory away from human greed and from our arrogance as humans that we have dominion over the world. We are just part of nature. We're not apart from nature. We are no more important than the butterfly or the bird or the fish in the ocean or the tree or the river. We are part of millions of species that share this planet. And we have to learn to live in balance with that planet and in balance between ourselves and all other species. And that's why, for me, the challenge was not just changing the system and fighting for rights, but taking the responsibility to learn to live in harmony and balance and equilibrium with the great mother, which is our earth. And so that's why the challenge that faces your generation as young people is not just changing the system. Essentially, it is about changing the human being. If we really had to ask ourselves a question today, which is the virus that most affects the world we live in? And while COVID-19 may be a virus that challenges our human well-being and public health, it has as much right to exist as we have. It is life. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing to destroy the blessing of a world that has been given to us? And how do we conduct ourselves in being good stewards of the Mother Earth that has been entrusted to us? And that's the challenge of young people today in the world.
So thank you very much for this detailed presentation. So you talked about generation. So you said that if your generation had listened to the previous generation, South Africa might still be under apartheid. Do you think it is always necessary to challenge and to break the rules in order to create social change?
Well, my parents and all the elders in my community at that point said, if you get involved in politics, then you will end up, like Mandela, going to jail or being arrested or being tortured, or at worst, being killed. But at a certain point, you've got to make a decision for yourself. The decision to become involved in changing something that is patently unjust is an individual decision. And when you make that individual decision, you will find along the way others that have made the same decision. And that's when you start to become connected to others in that initial streams of change that eventually become the river that becomes the tsunami of change. Yes, I would ask you to challenge old thinking, to challenge old paradigms of way in which we've done things, of old ideologies, of old systems, of old ways in which we organized ourselves. Much of our challenge today is the challenge of bureaucracy and inertia and vested interests. And those vested interests are not just in our economy, which is driven by the need to make profit and by our human greed in a way that is a linear economy. We need to challenge it to bring it to a circular economy. And that is why we have to embrace the type of economy that is circular, that is able to regenerate the environment rather than destroy the environment. Therefore, clean energy or regenerative ways of growing agriculture away from the industrial, chemical-driven agriculture. So yes, I am asking you as young people to challenge our thinking. And every generation has to find its voice, its struggle, its agency, and its destiny. We are at a crossroads today. And my generation, as the baby boomers, have held on to power longer than any other generation in human history. And we are sitting at the edge of an ecological emergency. We are sitting at the edge of a precipice. We cannot have business as usual. In fact, the model of development is broken. It was very relevant at the end of the Second World War, when the decision to set up the multilateral system that became the United Nations saw development as a critical side of the coin of preventing war. But that is now 70 years old. The world has changed fundamentally. The digital revolution has changed the way we think, the way we work, the way we live, the way we organize our lives, the way we communicate. But we're still locked into a model that is 70 years old. It's like you're going out to drive and you're taking a car that's got a 70-year-old chassis. Well, we need a new electric car today with new ideas, with new ways of how it operates. It'll still get you to a destination, but how it gets you there is different. And so I ask, in fact, and I insist that the time has come for us as my generation to pass the baton to younger people. We need new blood. We need new ideas. And that's why the idea of you as young people organizing yourselves in a different way, but around the same principles, the principles of honesty, of integrity, of compassion, of forgiveness, of reconciliation, Those are important principles that remain the same. They remain constant. How we achieve the world that embraces those human values, well, those strategy and tactics are what you will have to decide now. And I know that as an elder, I will stand behind you to build the world that is there for our future generations. Because science is telling us all science is telling us that we now literally have 12 years in which to change the trajectory of human civilization. Otherwise, it's game over for us as a human species, not for Mother Earth. Mother Earth has been here 4.5 billion years. We've been through 5 extinctions already, which are natural ones. This 6th extinction is caused by our greed, by our way in which we've far exceeded the planetary boundaries of Mother Earth to regenerate itself. And so the question really is not about Mother Earth. She's been here a long time. On average, it will take between 15 and 25 million years to recover from our stupidity. But she will recover. The question really is, are we as a species going to survive? That's the critical challenge facing us in this generation that you are. And I hope that you all make the right decisions to ensure the continued evolution of human beings, but in a different relationship with all the other species that we share our planet with.
Well, thank you very much. So just to follow up, we often say that environmental, cultural, and social change are very closely intertwined, as you've just shown it in what you said. So the richness of African civilization, cultures, and traditions are slowly being rehabilitated over the last decades, as well as other indigenous cultures from all over the world. What do we need to learn from these cultures?
Well, we have to learn everything. You know, our arrogance as a human species is that we believe that we have all knowledge. And, you know, I come from a point of view which says my ignorance is far greater than my knowledge. And that if I want to have greater and go from information, which is freely available through the internet and through the digital revolution, and transform information into knowledge that I can use to advance the way in which my ideas are articulated. But ultimately, I need to have wisdom, because wisdom is the way of life. So if you look at Africa, you know, Africa in the last 500 years has lived under the shadow of colonialism, of slavery, of apartheid, of the most brutal form of economic exploitation. Africa is a continent that is the richest continent in the world. You know, we walk in gold and diamonds and oil and platinum. Our forests are full of magnificent life, wildlife, tree life, flora and fauna. Our oceans are filled with marine resources, but our people are poor. The problem is governance and leadership. So how do we get to governance and leadership? We've got to understand what it means to be African. And the problem that we face, not just in Africa, but in much of the developing world, we want to be a poor photocopy, usually of the West. And we erase ourselves and our contribution. You know, if you look at the earliest technologies that we as humanity use, you know, the technology of language, technology of fire, technology of agriculture, technology of understanding your relationship with Mother Earth. These are all African. At the end of the day, Africa is the cradle of humanity. In fact, we all are Africans. And we've migrated across the world, inhabited the world, and developed into different cultures, into different languages, and different religions, and different ways in which we see ourselves. And then we created that differences between us. But ultimately, African wisdom is we all come from one. There's only one source of all knowledge. And so understanding what it means to be African is also building up the capacity of understanding what it means to be human. So beyond what my color of my skin is, beyond what my religion or culture is or language is, beyond my status and my gender, who am I? And that's what we can learn from indigenous wisdom and cultures. My greatest lessons of life were not learned from textbooks and being in university. As a trade union leader, I worked with hostel dwellers, migrant workers who came from the rest of the region and to work on the mines or to work in the factories of South Africa under very brutal conditions. Many were illiterate, they could not read or write. But in fact, they were my greatest teachers of life. My education was life, not a textbook. And so you would get a lot of knowledge from listening to elders, particularly those that still remain deep in their culture and their traditions and the ways of living. In many indigenous cultures, for example, the Native American culture, the grandmothers are the ones that make all the main decisions. The Iroquois in the United States think of life and decision-making in the context of 7 generations. Whatever decision we make now, what will the impact of that decision be in 7 generations? Now, shouldn't we think intergenerationally? Or are we so selfish that we want to think and grab everything for ourselves? Yet if you understand who we are here for such a brief moment. And the idea of being here through this human experience is to embrace life and do something worthwhile with your life. And being worthwhile is meaning evolving your intelligence that we've been endowed with, which unlike any other species, it's an intelligence that allows us to make choices. We can choose to be good or we can choose to be bad. We can choose to be loving or we can choose to be hateful. That's a choice we have. And through that choice and that intelligence, are we making the right choices? And as individuals, as countries, as tribes, as different generations? And the answer clearly today is no. We see the rise of right-wing populism and fascism. We see the corruption that is, strangling the lifeblood of democracy in all our countries. We see the arrogance of those in power. We see even in this pandemic in the last year, the 1%, according to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, have made $5 trillion in profit when millions and millions of people don't have food on their table. It cannot be just. It cannot be human. It cannot be what we celebrate as civilization. And so what we require today is a different way. And perhaps we go back to the beginning of the beginning. That human life in the form that we are today has evolved over millions of years. But the species who we are, called Homo sapiens, have been here for 200,000 years. And in 150 years, we've almost brought humanity – and we've brought Mother Earth to its knees. Now ask yourself the question, have we earned the right to be here? Because that's your responsibility. It's not about how many followers you have on Twitter or how many likes you have on Facebook. It's what kind of human being you are that evolves the consciousness of humanity to understand its stewardship and custodian role in society. And that's why Mandela often said to me, the most difficult journey you will make in life is the one from your head to your heart, from the arrogance of the ego, which is embedded in a cesspool of cravings, of desires, of attachments, to the seat of the soul, which is your heart, in which rests the real humanity, the real meaning of life, which is compassion, which is generosity, which is love, which is reconciliation, which is forgiveness, which is seeing the connection, not just between me and human beings, but me and everything that exists on our earth. And that's what my hope is that we will evolve. And so the challenge of your generation as young people is not just to fight against what is wrong, and there's many things wrong, there are some things right, but to fight for and build and co-create what is going to be important for the future generations. And that is protecting and defending the blessings that we have of clean water, of land that is able to produce the food that ensures that we live well and we live healthily, to preserve our oceans and their resources, to preserve our forests, to preserve our wildlife and its magnificent diversity. That's your challenge, not the accumulation of money that ends up with the destruction of our environment and creating a world in which your money can't buy anything anyway. So we have to change that model of consumption towards a model of a circularity, of living in a way and working in a way and building economies in a way that regenerates the environment rather than destroys our environment.
You often talk about the great transition, which would be a social, cultural, and civilizational change in global society. How would you describe this ideal, and how can we try to live with that?
I don't think that I'm talking about it. I think it is happening. The great transition is happening. It's a civilizational transition because more and more young people are not interested in going in becoming a banker and to joining some big corporate and then driving some fancy car and having some suburban home with two cars in the garage, if I look at myself, my wife and I have given our home in Johannesburg to become a center for women and children, because that's what we need to do. And we are now living in a small house in a nature conservancy with 4 solar panels and water from a borehole. And it's enough for us. The question you have to ask is, what is enough? So what is the meaning of success? And we have to get away from this addiction to accumulation as success. In fact, the greatest success in life is becoming nobody, in which you understand that everything you've done in life is immaterial, but it's just a way in which you see life. That life is a flow of experiences. It's like a river. We think the river remains the same, but the river changes every nanosecond. That's life. Life is a flow of experiences. Some of them are very joyful and they make you laugh. Some of them are very loving and you feel warmly embraced. Some of them hurt you. Some of them are extremely painful. the way in which one gets to live is to see all of those experiences, what you chose to have. And sometimes the most painful experiences you have are the ones through which you grow the most, you understand the most. And so the important goal in life is not to get stuck in the quicksand of human emotions and human trauma, is to rise above it, ultimately to rise above the narrowness of the mind, of the intellect, of even the body, and to transcend that into a greater consciousness of who we are. And that's when it becomes very clear that everything in life is connected. In fact, even quantum physics today agrees that the end of all matter, whether it's us or a tree or a rock or a bird, is a vibration of energy. And that energy is the only constant thing. Call it what you want to call it. It's greater than us. Some people call it divine. In the Native Americans, they call it Manitou. In Amazon, they call it Yushabu. In religion, they call it God. I think those are really important ways of description of something bigger than us, but that connects us. When we see that connection, then we understand we've made the real transition. We've evolved as a species. Transition is not having more and more gadgets, more and more applications, more and more followers on Facebook. Transition civilizationally is to a greater consciousness, where I see the connection between you. And all of this technology are these tools to help me become a better human being, to become what we call a supramental human being, going beyond the limitations of your mind. And how we live our life should be in that same principle of living in harmony with that. So the greatest journey in this transition is not the creating a new technology outside, because all technologies are the creation of this body, of this mind. Everything that exists out there started as an idea in this head and then became a manifestation of that. So imagine if we create the idea that every technology we create should be for the rising of the human consciousness. Imagine if we did that. If we went to plant food, we did it in the point of view that we'll build a relationship with the earth, that the earth is us. We're not living on earth, we are the earth. Because the earth is a living being with life on a scale unimaginable, with billions and trillions of microorganisms. And those microorganisms give us the nutrients that when we plant a seed, it grows into the type of crops that we then eat and that create human cells that become us. So at the end of the day, we are a pile of soil, because that soil has alchemized seeds to create the food that we eat, and then we are food. So the most efficient recycling that we should understand is Mother Earth. She has given us every single atom that makes up this body, and when we leave this physical body, she'll take back every single atom. So understand that. And then will you go and poison the soil? Because you're poisoning yourself. So if you start to understand that as the basis of transition, then you will not do things that destroy the world given to us to look after and that threatens the future generations. And that's the essence of the great transition. It's the transition within, and making sure that you build an equilibrium between the inside and the outside. And then that allows you to transcend the narrowness of a mind that makes you feel you are superior because you're a different color, or you have a different religion, you have a different culture, you have a different language. The arrogance of the human mind. It is possible to transcend that. And that is the great transition that will enable us to live in harmony on this planet with each other and with everything we share the planet with.
Well, thank you again for this very inspiring words. To follow up on what you said about women being the sanctuaries for sacred and, for example, grandmothers who took care of the education and everything. You said that one of the big lessons you have learned over the years is the need to return to the sacred feminine. So Africa is known for being the continent with the highest rate of women entrepreneurs and women who take action. Do you think women are the future of leadership?
I think that the issue of the sacred feminine is a central plank of the grand transition we need in civilization. We have lived in extremely patriarchal societies for tens of thousands of years. And that has permeated the very DNA of how we live on a day-to-day reality. So whether you look at religion, you look at politics, you look at business, you look at civil society, you look at the family, the notion that man has dominion is a flawed notion. In fact, it is the great flaw that has led us to all the divisiveness and violence that we see today in the world. And that has to be dislodged. It has to be eradicated. We have to eradicate toxic masculinity. And I'm not talking about just the rights of women. As a trade union leader, we fought for the right of women not to be fired when they fell pregnant, which was a reality. We fought for the rights of women to be paid the same wage or salary for the same job. But the sacred feminine goes far beyond that. That if you look at life itself is feminine. It's a feminine energy that creates life. That's why we call it Mother Earth. That's why women give birth to children and not men. So there have been differing roles for men and women. The role traditionally of men is that of the hunter, the protector, the guarder of the security of a community. But it was the grandmothers that held the power. So many societies were very matriarchal, or there was an intelligent cooperation between the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine. But we lost that as we became civilized in our own way, which created many perversions of civilization. Toxic masculinity began to percolate that civilization to a point where women's role was reduced to that of reproduction, to being in the home and being at the beck and call of men. So any culture that advocates female mutilation is wrong, it's harmful, and we should call it out for what it is. No one has a right to mutilate something that is created in the eyes and the image of the divine. So the relationship we're looking for in this great transition, which is happening at the moment, we as humanity have to decide whether we are going to be part of it. Because we just like, I would describe humanity as, we're like a bunch of fleas on the back of an elephant, So we don't have dominion over anything. There's something greater than us that will determine what life is. If we have that sense of humility, then we understand our role. That we are now moving into an era in which we have to leave behind patriarchy in all its forms. We have to celebrate a new cooperation, intelligent cooperation between men and women and between humanity and every other species that exists on our planet. That's the true goal of your generation. And so, yes, I think we need to take a stand on anything that undermines the role of women. And so if we want to bring nurturing, which is life, which is values, which is the idea of protecting the vulnerable, protecting everything that lives, it's a sacred feminine. A sacred masculine recognizes that and sees how it can work with that. And that's the mind shift we need in men. In fact, to build the world we have to build where there's respect for the sacred feminine, which is rising in the world today, a lot of work that I would have to do as elder and as a man is with boys and men. But wherever we see patriarchy, we need to challenge it. Because patriarchy is like a cancer. It manifests in different ways, in racism, in sexism, in rape, in violence against children, in violence against Mother Earth. The violence that we see in the world has its beginnings in the toxic masculinity. So I think if men begin to think differently about their role and respect women for the role that they play, an equivalent and equal role, then we will build a type of civilization. We would make the type of grand transition to one of peace and harmony and coexistence rather than war and arming ourselves and even, flooding the world with weapons. It'll be a different approach to how we see ourselves as humanity.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned a lot the necessity to protect the environment and biodiversity, but what concrete actions are you implementing for this?
Well, part of the conversation I'm having with young people today across Africa is Africa has 60% of the remaining cultivatable arable land in the world. And much of the land in the world has now been poisoned, particularly in the developed world, through a chemical-driven agricultural model. And if you look at the role of those chemicals and the origins of it, it comes out of making bombs in the Second World War. And so what we see is a continuing war through agriculture on Mother Earth. And now we see that the lands in many of these countries are poisoned and incapable of producing food that is rich in calories or nutritious. They are coming into Africa to grab our land. But Africa remains an epicenter of hunger, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa. And when I talk to women who are producing 90% of the food we eat in Africa outside countries like South Africa, these subsistence farmers, women, say, well, they don't have resources to grow food, but they know what to do. So we've got to look at the barriers that face women in particular and see how we can help them graduate out of subsistence farming and then into a regenerative model of agriculture. And so we've got to look at the barriers very closely. And how do we make agriculture a career path for young people? And so if we remove the barriers, which is give legal ownership to land to women, support them with microfinance in order that they can build their seed banks, their nurseries, their irrigation, help them get fair prices for their products and for their crops beyond, the middlemen that take a lot of the profit. And we will see the end of malnutrition in Africa, that today affects, close to 240 million people. We could see Africa becoming the hub of feeding the world, plus restoring human well-being and health, and increasing incomes of women. Because we know when we increase incomes of women, they will invest it in their nutrition, education, and health of their children. So there are many multiplier benefits of investing in women. And I'm working with many people in the world to try and see how we can create a regenerative, conservation-driven model of agriculture. And that's one big thing. The second thing that I believe is a conversation we got to have with young people. There are many elders like me who want to contribute, don't want to lead organizations any longer, don't want to, have a title for anything, but we have our experience of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and where we want to support young people actually find their voice and their agency and their struggle for the Africa that they want. And so we are constructing an intergenerational forum in which we will bring elders together with young people and look at how do we organize? How do we build activism? How do we build the Africa that we are proud of? And our job is to listen to them carefully and to stand behind them, shoulder to shoulder. That's the commitment that I have made. And that commitment is making sure at the heart of it is how do we restore our relationship with Mother Earth and live in harmony and balance with her. And everything else will then fall into place. Access to clean energy, access to technologies that allow people to build their own pathways of hope and opportunity. But I see the biggest contribution I can make as an individual today and an elder is to stand behind young people and to support them.
Well, thank you so much. Now I have a more personal question for you. You have worked very closely with Nelson Mandela and you knew him very well. And Mandela is one of these figures who inspire a lot of people in the world. So in all the years of fighting and then working in office with him, what is, according to you, the best moment you shared with him? Could you tell us this moment, please?
The best moment was every moment.
That's a good question, but that's a good answer.
But, I think that, I was one of the first people that arrived at Victor Verster prison to pick him up when he was released in 1990, the 11th of February. Yeah, so, when I arrived at the prison, the extraordinary thing was, here was someone who had influenced so much in my life. He represented the symbol of our resistance to apartheid, the symbol of our hopes for a better future. And, we were escorted by the police to the door of the little house that they had let him stay in the last years. And he opens the door and he says, "Hello, welcome my comrades." And then he proceeded to take us on a tour of the house, of where he was staying. And he was pointing out the microphones where they were tapping his conversations. And then he showed us the room where he slept. And it was the smallest room because remember, he had lived for so many years, 18 years, he had lived in a cell that's 8 feet by 12 feet. And so he felt a sense of security living in that place. And, the bed was perfectly made. And then we sat down and said, okay, he said, let's have some tea. And here was an icon you're fighting for who represents our liberation. And he was like a grandfather taking care of us. And so that's the amazing thing about a Mandela. In his presence, it didn't matter whether you're the Queen of England or you were a trade unionist, or you were the waiter in the banquets that we used to have when we had state banquets. You were the center of his universe. So you felt the center of his universe. You felt his energy. And that's the extraordinary thing about it. We all have the capacity to find the Mandela inside of us, not to constantly look outside of us for another Mandela, you know. We all have the potential to become Mandela, or to become an extraordinary human being. In fact, it should be ordinary to become extraordinary, like him. That's how we will change the world. And so, you know, Mandela was the type of person who always put the needs of others ahead of his. In his whole life, it was always the needs of the country, of the children, of the people who are oppressed. And, you know, if we could just take a little bit of that and, you know, selflessness, and live that a little bit every day, and we'll build an armada of millions of little boats that will lift the tide of humanity into a greater consciousness. And so, yes, you know, I remember, you know, if you're thinking about Mandela and you're thinking about, you know, I was the Minister of Reconstruction and Development, and we were launching Masakani campaign, a big campaign about rights and responsibilities of citizens. And we were there with my wife and our 2-year-old son. And Mandela was making the opening speech. And every time he tried to, you know, read his speech, my son would run up and, you know, tug at his pants, you know. So the first time I went and I picked him up and I took him, put him in my lap. And the second time my wife went, put him in. The third time he went and ran to Mandela. Mandela took him and put him on the podium and said, "This young man wants to make my speech." And so, yes, he had the sense of not feeling offended, but taking this interference, which many politicians would have seen as a nuisance, and making it part of who he is. There's an extraordinary human being who radiated a positive way of living and thinking, and making you want to become a better human being. So there are many stories like that, you know, that he related to us and shared with us. And, you know, his greatest expectation was that we'll celebrate freedom, not just in the physical and material manifestation of freedom, but we really begin to in a sense, shake off the shackles that hold us down as human beings in the narrowness and arrogance and pettiness of ourselves, of our mind. And I think that's the great hope. And that's why I continue to do what I do, because I am part of those emissaries that are here to remind us that it's okay to be ordinary. In fact, being ordinary is really good. But we've got to make ordinary mean something in the greater good that we want to do in this world, to make our lives more worthwhile, to live with a greater awareness. And if we live with that greater awareness, then, you know, if we are coming back again into another human experience, we don't have to repeat the same trauma and suffering and pain. We've learned the lesson. We've passed the grade. And so the purpose of education should be to pass the grade to a greater awareness of everything in relation to yourself and in relation to everything that exists, that you are surrounded by. And that's the lesson of Mandela.
I think Clemence will agree with me. The words you are sharing with us are particularly inspiring because even when discussing issues as serious as the environmental crisis, you managed to keep an extraordinarily optimistic view. And we want to know, where do you find such strength and hope?
Optimism. But think about it. We're here for such a brief moment, even if you live for 100 years, in a context where the planet is 4.5 billion years old. It's, a billionth of a blink of an eyelid. Why shouldn't you embrace life, every minute of it, even the harsh moments of it? If you see it as a school, then yes, enjoy the lesson of life. Life it's like energy. It's a great energy. It's a tsunami. Imagine a cosmic tsunami. Now you either learn to surf that tsunami or you'll get crushed by it. You'll fall under the wave. And so if you live life in this moment I am talking to you as young people and I'm inspired by you. So I get my energy from you. I'm in this moment. If I'm thinking about the past and I'm thinking about what happened in South Africa to all our dreams, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what's happening there? The corruption, the hunger, the violence, the fighting, then I'll be depressed about it. So if I'm thinking about the future, but where are we going to? And COVID is here and it's changed the world. And I look at it and say, yes, yay, we want a world that is changed. And maybe COVID was sent to us to make us more aware. But if I keep thinking about the future and how bad it is, then I'm going to become anxious. I'll live in anxiety. But if I live in this moment I'm talking through wonderful young people who inspire me and give me the energy. I take that energy. It's available to us all. Just draw on it. It's life. Don't be miserable. And at the end of the day, we are 100% responsible for our misery or our happiness. But you have to almost journey inside yourself, beyond the mind and the body and the intellect, and you'll come to that shadow we face within. And there's a way to transmute, to alchemize that shadow. There's nothing about negative or positive energy. It just is. It's positive, it's negative. It doesn't mean one is good, one is bad. There's light and there's darkness. There's love and there's hate. There's tolerance and there's intolerance. It's your choice. You can choose to be miserable about everything and complain about everything. Or you can choose to say, oh man, that's an exciting challenge now. I wish I was 40 years younger. This is the most exciting moment to be alive. We are sitting at the edge of a precipice. We got no parachute, but we're going to have to jump into the unknown. We're the last generation. You are the last generation that has the understanding of what the future looks like, with the means and the technology and the numbers. The vast majority of people in the world are young. In Africa, 60% of people, of 1.3 billion people, are under 25. You have the maths on your side if you're organized to make a different world. So you're the last generation that can save this humanity, and with the means and the technology and the numbers to make it happen. So it's an exciting roller coaster that you should be going into. Let's enjoy the ride. Look forward to it. Break down all the barriers that you have imposed on yourself, because this human intelligence you're endowed with has the creativity to solve any problem that you face. And if you root that intelligence in your heart, then you're guided in a way that means that the outcome will be a greater consciousness and living more consciously on a more conscious planet. And that is the goal of life. So enjoy the journey, enjoy the ride.
Well, thank you for all this advice. As we're reaching the end of our conversation, I would just like you to give, well, if you could just give in 1 or 2 sentences, a piece of advice to the African youth, because as you know, Share Africa is an initiative that aims at inspiring the youth in Africa. So what would you say in like 1 or 2 sentences to these people who are listening?
In Africa, I am asking young people to question everyone and to question everything, and to find your voice, your agency, your passion, your inspiration, to make an Africa which is inclusive, in which we have participatory democracy, and where African citizens, 1.3 billion of us, are beneficiaries of the enormous resources, both natural and mineral, that we are endowed with. So it's up to you to make the Africa that Africans want.
Wow, what a nice ending. Naidoo, thank you so much for your time and this great discussion full of hope and optimism about the future of Africa and the young generation. We were very honored to have you as our guest today for the Share Africa interview. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you. Enjoyed that.